Clear up the closing doors, please.
I'm Emily Lutzker.
And I'm Anna Kamasia. Today, International Arrival speaks with Linda Sormin, a ceramic artist and professor at NYU. Her work explores upheaval, migration, survival, and change through sculpture and site-responsive installation.
Welcome, Linda.
Welcome, Linda.
Hi.
Hi, thank you both so much for having me.
Thank you for coming to chat with us here in the Lower East Side, but you don't live far away, do you?
No, 15-minute walk.
That's nice.
Okay.
Us too is exactly 15 minutes.
We walked here.
Yeah.
Love it.
We always ask this, and I think that you've probably got an interesting story. It consists of a lot of movement. I think you were also in Canada before you got here. How did that go?
Do you want the long story or the real? There's, a long connection with cities that are frenetic and overfilled and busy, and Bangkok is where I was born. So it's always been this kind of sense of recognition when I visit New York, and I always am drawn to that kind of energy here, and I feel alert. And in my art practice, it's been important for me to feel that disturbance of being in a crush of people and in conversations with people like yourselves, and having the chance to test ideas and work. So I was born in Thailand, and when I was 5, my parents moved my brother and I to Canada. And as a racialized arrivant settler and living as a guest in many Indigenous lands, I have been kind of connecting with my place of origin in fragments, because different parts of my family come from different parts of the world. And so I never quite feel at home in any one place. And that kind of journey has led me back and forth between Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, China, and the places where my family originates from, but then also coming back and forth to North America, to Canada, the US. I was at Alfred University before I was here, so upstate, having a training in ceramics. Alfred is a place where the ground is full of clay, which isn't so easy on farmers, but it's great for brick makers and industry. And so I went to grad school and had a lot of clay training. So that connection to here, coming here next, is very related. Even the subways in New York City are run on these porcelain ceramic parts that are made in.
Really? Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that. Oh, wow.
At Victor insulators, those ceramic insulators. So I'm kind of seeing, all these ways to kind of connect to the ground, literally through the practice of ceramics.
Wow. I just wanted to ask about the Thai connection, because you're both Thai and Indonesian. Am I correct?
Thai Chinese. So my mom's
okay.
family would move back and forth between China and southern Thailand. And my father's family is originally from Indonesia, North Sumatra, but then he was born in Malaysia and grew up in Singapore. So this kind of diasporic experience
Wow.
goes back generations.
So that kind of feeds into this question of then, like, when you think about identification, how do you begin, or where do you start, or how do you locate yourself, or is that even possible?
I think a lot of my experience is quite dislocated. I'm in one place and I still am thinking and reflecting on something that happened in another place, because I've just been very kinetic in the way that my life has just kind of moved me along. I don't know if it's by choice only. Even in Batak culture, my father's culture, there's a tradition of merantau. And merantau is a tradition where 18-year-old young people are expected to move out of the village and start their own family and have, ties to another place and find their own kind of tree in the middle of a place to build their own community around. So that act of moving away from home is, I think, kind of an epigenetic practice that I didn't really understand until I started reaching back into my family's history and learning more about some of the cultural practices that feel contemporary but are actually quite old and traditional.
You were young when your family moved to Canada, right? So what was happening in Thailand at the time that made your parents decide to move?
It was more what was happening in Malaysia. My father had a Malaysian citizenship, and as independence was gained, the British government gave a notice to people with the passport that they would either need to move back to Malaysia, where my father had never lived, hadn't been part of that culture for too long. So my relatives all chose to move to Canada, and we were the last family to leave Asia. So I think it was more just to meet the rest of the family in a place that they had chosen to make a new home.
It's really interesting because I think that so often we think about this movement of people as a like 1 to 2, and it's always way more complex than we make it out to be. It's always kind of like, oh, home and not home, but it's actually so rich and dense and complex. As we start to talk about your work a little bit more, I think that really comes through the complexity of thinking through whether it's your own identity or whether it's heritage or whether it's these traditions that are passed through the use of clay.
Yeah, I think if we think of, our work practice as a map, I think that's why mine can be so literally convoluted and tangled, because there's not one kind of point A to point B. There are many points interacting with each other, and things having a different timelines.
And that works for language too. I mean, then, whether you speak, I mean, I don't know what other languages you speak, but do you?
I spoke Thai growing up.
Okay.
So I speak Thai as a 5-year-old might, maybe worse than a 5-year-old who's fluent in Thai would, but I was fluent. And then in my 20s, I worked in the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and I learned Lao conversationally there as well. So I was speaking, and those two languages are very closely related, Thai and Lao. So I was able to kind of understand the culture much more deeply when I could put words to the experiences that in European or Western culture often go unsaid. There are words for flavors or even a work experience. The word pleun has been part of my practice. My mother taught me the word of what it means to be so engrossed in what you're doing, a physical activity, usually a task, or for me, pinching clay or working with ceramics in this kind of repetitive way that generates linear elements that kind of spread apart and wander. And that sense of being in the zone is pleun, and that I don't think there's a word for that.
So pleun is in the zone.
Yeah, it's not exact. I mean, in the zone is a little bit more
a Western way of thinking about it.
Yeah, hip sounding and feeling, but pleun is just, there's a sense of contentment that goes with it too, and pleasure that comes from this repetitive labor of making a mark over and over, like I do with my kind of bare hands.
Oh, that's interesting, though, that the pleasure is part of that understanding too, of just you're in this world.
Yeah, part of that haptic experience.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about your work, which is unusual for ceramic, I might say, because it is installation based and often takes up an entire gallery. Something that you don't necessarily associate with ceramics. For listeners who have never seen your work, how would you describe what they will see?
The work starts with a very intimate gesture of touching clay and responding to it in real time, in the moment. And that touch will lead to another touch and another touch, and that momentum builds. They kind of hold the unspeakable states of being or emotions that I can't express through language in the moment. And so in coming into one of my installations, you might see something that looms overhead or that is jagged and raw and has parts that don't quite fit together. There's a sense of awkwardness and aggression, even in some of the parts. There's jagged metal and broken shards. I collect found objects that tell stories from different people's experiences of holding them or having them in their collections. People have keepsakes or souvenirs that are broken and discarded, and I find them in thrift shops. And so bringing in these little samples of other people's lives and stories, I weave them, I knit them into these vessels of kind of unraveled ceramic process. So taking, I was trained in very traditional modes of coil building and making pottery, and that act of making something to contain and to offer and to serve tea or cookies or something nourishing. I really needed that metaphor to shift to reflect my experience of what it meant to live in the contemporary world that I was living in. So coming straight from the Lao People's Democratic Republic, where I was working for a humanitarian aid agency and for a telecom company, all these experiences in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors really gave me a sense of how unstable the world was, how things were not whole, not holdable. I wanted an alternative to be something that offered a sense of loss and upheaval.
And fractured and fragmentary. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
all things that I would associate with your, or words that I would use to describe your work too. And it almost has an organic feel as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I see the images of the work, and it's the opposite of a vessel that holds something that's contained. And it's these strips or waves or kneaded coils that have been flattened and mushed and woven and in a sort of mushed together and exploded and in many different colors and creating this volume, but that has empty spaces and light going in between it. And there's no smooth roundness of a vessel or a pot that you throw. It doesn't have that. It's rough, but it has like a shiny ceramic surface in parts of it, and all different colors put together, woven, like reaching or thrown or moving in some way, which is not very traditional ceramic at all.
And the work that was at the Carleton University Art Gallery had a boat also. And I think that the boat becomes such a trope in contemporary work for these journeys across bodies of water, for people who have immigrated, migrants, refugees, all of those people. And so I think about connections with the body and sort of like the parts of your body, the insides of your body, and tendrils and hair and intestines. Like there's that kind of like this fractured, fragmentary explosion of pieces.
Speaking of organic, like you mentioned, there's this organic feel, and literally there is actually clay, raw clay in the installations. And so in Ottawa, it was Leda clay, which is the thixotropic clay, which is under many of the buildings in Ottawa, in our capital city. And Leda clay is prone to causing landslides, because thixotropic clay, when you hit it or when it experiences trauma or force, it turns to liquid. And so buildings list, and this is why roads wash away in Norway. So the QAG team found 1,000 pounds of this raw clay that I was able to incorporate and help to tell the story of the place.
But it's also then about not fixing anything. I mean, it's always about change. It's always about transformation. It's always about this process we're talking about of like continuing, and that it's never finished, and that it's not stable. It's always something that's shifting and changing.
Yeah, you both touched on the sense of things being unresolved. You know, that
Right.
sense of things just not. This is impossible task of concluding. You know, so that sense of being unfinished or unsaid or half spoken or half held. I want that spill,
complete,
the
like
spill.
Yeah, that idea of being complete, whether that's about identity or self or work or histories, or I mean, there is no complete narrative, story, self, all of those things.
And yet there's a longing for it. It's not that
I think that's
it's not
the
that I'm-
quest. I think that's what we're
Yeah.
looking for, is like to feel that sense of completion. But I think that it's always about knowing that it's going to change too, whatever that is that you're seeking. And maybe this is a good time to talk about scale then, because then, you know, you have all of these kind of impulses in your work that we're saying, you know, work against in many ways traditional, what we think about as traditional ceramic. But then you also play with scale by filling the gallery space with your work. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about scale there.
Yeah, as I mentioned a little earlier, each gesture in the clay, each movement and every mark is accumulative, you know, so it becomes this kind of growing, surging kind of kitsch. My friend David Bateman, who's a Canadian poet, calls it a kitsch apocalypse, you know, this sense of things, like you said, Emily, exploding and bursting beyond its own limits. And so I think that's the sense of scale that I am reaching for in those installations, is something that I can't hold. I can't see it beyond my peripheral vision. It's something that is overwhelming and not all pleasant. It's sometimes in some ways physically threatening. on the verge of collapse, all of these points of precarity that I think many of us experience as part of our day-to-day struggles.
That's a nice phrasing, bursting beyond its limits.
And yet they come from really small, intimate gestures. It just got me to think about the vessel, and then one of my friends, Timothy Berg, who's also a sculptor, and he saw me using found objects from my apartment. Anything I wasn't using, I was bringing and putting it into these webs, these networks of clay, playing with the idea of a container. And he took a tissue and he blew his nose and he stuffed one into my pieces. And I was outraged, of course, because we take ourselves so seriously in grad school. But I got to thinking, that sometimes the harshest critiques can be the thing that motivates and can be a catalyst for something that expands beyond your comfort zone. And so I really kind of, started bringing in things that were not appealing, weren't cute or marketable or collectible even, but things that felt genuine in the way that they were sharing something about human experience or encounter, including times of upheaval and loss and change in people's lives.
And can you just name a few of those things that you incorporated?
So one of the things that I did in grad school was just, I didn't have time to do things like, paint toenails or anything. So all of the toenail separators would go in, an old bag that I wasn't using. When I invite people to bring their objects into my installations, they offer things like one of my friend's grandmothers passed away and her porcelain collection came into the work. So it's often precious treasures from a family that are gifted to the installation, which I'm very humbled by, that kind of very personal offering. At QAG, the Carleton University Art Gallery.
Shout out.
Yes. Heather Anderson curated a show where I created a space where I invited people from Ottawa and the surrounding area to bring in objects. And people brought hospital gowns. And the story that came with the hospital gown was someone had a very serious surgery the year before and had somehow, for some reason, kept the hospital gown, but then wanted to, leave that behind in her healing process and brought it to the installation. So that got woven into the stories of other people who brought like one lost mitten or souvenir.
And when you weave these objects into the work, do they stay in the work?
They do for the length of the installation. So often they're raw clay. So I just bring raw clay into the space and start to respond to the architecture and to the stories that I hear about the institution or the community. One colleague who was teaching at Carleton University brought in her mother's expired sauces, soy sauces and other expired sauces. And just so that kind of inhabits a certain kind of space, not just in the imagination, but literally in the community. So people can come and add their own stories verbally as well through language.
And do you account for those stories in any way, or are they just for you?
Well, at Carleton University, it was a chance to invite the conversation to be a part of the CBC programming. So in that case, it was recorded and was able to share that conversation with people in Canada at a lunch hour.
So all of your installations are site responsive. So you see a space, you go in there, you said with raw clay, and people bring stuff to you. So what happens next? You make some things, you fire the clay, or how does that work?
It depends on the installation. In New Orleans, for example, there was a 3-week workshop that at Louisiana Artworks, and there was a chance for people to actually build with me. So they brought in objects, and we built in raw clay, and we fired together, and then we installed in the gallery together over a period of 3 weeks. We also did, we wrote creative writing. It was a creative writing and ceramic workshop. So there was the active language and the unspoken happening with the same group of people over a longer amount of time than usual, which is really fruitful. It really becomes this space that trust can be built, and we're able to be more vulnerable with each other, and I'm able to offer my own vulnerability to the work in a different way when that happens.
Exactly. The longer time you spend together, the more you feel like you can open up and share those experiences or past experiences or whatever it is that you want to share.
And then sometimes it's just raw clay. So sometimes people will just, at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, people came in, and my only prompt was work with me, make shapes with the clay and include the things that you bring, but then leave something unfinished. So the next group coming in will kind of pick up where you left off. So kind of this kind of loose, exquisite corpse prompt. The sentence is left unfinished, or the phrase is left open for someone else to reinterpret, or actually sometimes break. One of the students came in and said, "Can I break some of these things?" I'm like, yeah, just put on these safety goggles. And so that was part of it too, is unbuilding and opening up the work in ways that invited another kind of response from the next people coming in.
I think this idea of unbuilding or breaking apart or fragmenting, I think you can talk about it too in terms of deconstruction and deconstructing Western sensibilities around ceramics, aesthetics, beauty, all of those things that I think that you're working against in many ways with your work. And you have talked in the past too about claymaking as a way to decolonize claymaking. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the ways in which your use of clay and clay making and traditions of clay work as kind of a decolonizing of the clay making process.
For a long time, I just kind of chafed under this assumption that the ways that we made were supposed to be a certain way. The dogma that can be very present in different craft practices was part of my training in clay. It was also a really amazing way to learn skill. And so, there's kind of double-edged sword, but there's also this kind of way of judging and evaluating whether this touch is the appropriate touch within a medium, which that's very personal and subjective. We would think, but there is kind of an encoded way of gatekeeping with who has the right touch, and even the language that is used around clay. I was part of a white gold symposium at the Royal College of Art in London, and through a 3-day conference, there was so many important things being said. But one of the things that really bothered me, what really made me rewrite my presentation and contribution to that dialogue, was the kind of language around porcelain. Porcelain is translucent, transcendent, pure. It's had this kind of fetishization of whiteness that I was quite disturbed by. And back in 2005, I didn't have exactly the right language, but I definitely wanted to grapple with it and what I offered. And so, in that presentation, I was really quite clear, and it kind of galvanized my kind of gut feeling that this is, something that, yes, it sounds like it's just language, but it has a lot of repercussions for how and who feels included in the endeavor to be creative in this field. I mean, to the point where just whether we, call red clay and white clay, or terracotta or porcelain or stoneware, the ways that we call the clays, as well as, what we refer to as contamination in the studio, if some red clay gets into the porcelain bucket, that all of these things that are things that I make a case for against in my teaching practice, but also in the way that I try to shape language and disrupt some of the conventions of how,
and narratives of this, that we look to white porcelain, or we look to Greek classical sculptures as the pinnacle of what art should be or could be or was. And I think that language and artistic production cannot be separated. I think they are entangled together all the time. And so I think it does matter the way that you approach porcelain and the language you use and the way that it can reify very racist terminologies and understandings of the way that the world operates.
Absolutely. I learned a lot from my colleagues. My first place that I lived after grad school was Vancouver, and I was part of a group of friends and colleagues that really were activists and were able to write and articulate things that I was just learning at the time. So Ashok Mathur wrote about what it meant to have the body in the clay. I didn't have the language to wrap around that experience and to understand that my racialized body was significant in the act of changing, transforming the material, the forms, but also the intentions and contexts around this was something that I'm really grateful to that whole art community in Vancouver for.
Yeah.
And they continue to teach me a lot. The Canadian conversation around decolonization and issues that aren't always obvious to people working in ceramics. It was an experience that allowed me to access something just through touch and through my body to understand things about the world and to effect change in the world. And that for me was transformative to an English major who was used to kind of being in my head.
Did you ever try experimenting working without the ceramics, working without the clay?
Yeah, I started actually painting and with painting and printmaking and poetry. My parents were not going to let me become an art major in college. And, it was only recently that I was thinking about how afraid they must have been for our future, having come over themselves as educators, but then having to clean toilets for the first years of living in Canada. And they were really like, no, you cannot do art. So I did English at first, but having always wanting to be in the art studio, the writing and the artwork always kind of intermixed. And now painting is coming back into my practice, and I'm playing with video, sound. And in 2020, I started messing with VR a bit with some of my students at NYU. We weren't able to be part of the same classroom space for several weeks. And because we couldn't be together, everyone kind of took 100 pictures all around of each of their pieces. And then we, through photogrammetry, made 3D scans of the work. And we met in virtual space with VR headsets, and we're able to be in conversation in ways that were really moving because we could feel that we were close. We had headphones on just like this, and it felt really intimate. And we were able to lift the work up, work that was usually too heavy to lift, and we could scale it. We could make it really big. We could stick it on walls, be underneath it. We could walk through it. So having that kind of alternative space to actual physical touch was really exciting.
That seems like a great use for VR also.
Yeah.
To be able to experiment like that in a space.
Need-based
exactly.
VR.
Need-based, but where the laws of gravity don't come into account, like any laws of physics.
Yeah.
That's what creating a virtual reality is for, not for recreating this world, but for experimenting in somewhere where we can't be, and then maybe you recreate that outside, or maybe not.
Absolutely. And that interdisciplinary dialogue could be very rich when there isn't kind of spatial or distance restrictions in that kind of virtual experience.
And in some ways, it really mimics the way that at least your story is, where you have different connections in different places. And so it mimics this network that also is mimicked, I think, in your work, in the way that it expands in the gallery.
Yeah.
It's this idea of networks and connectors.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that comes the whole, problematic technical issues. There's always a glitch here and there, but same with ceramics. There's always a ceramic clay or glaze glitch. And so that sense of things not behaving as they should, or misbehaving.
And so are you using that? And you said you were now incorporating sound and video. So are you starting to think about how the glitch comes into play in those elements as well?
Yes. So scanning my work, but also doing it in ways, with cheap apps that will definitely glitch and animate and, use all of the different shapes and colors that don't quite work together. Or if I'm moving too quickly, something will cause a disruption on the screen or in the scan. I'm really interested in that in 3D scans and 3D printing. When a scan of my body fallen, I was kind of responding to a story that is in my family, a very old story where my great-great-grandfather fell. And so I wanted to fall and capture that moment by being scanned in 3D. And then when at the European Ceramic Word Center, we printed that out in porcelain, there are parts of the leg and parts of the body that are scanned perfectly, but the clay is too heavy. Little tiny coils of porcelain will droop And so there's this kind of really lacy glitch that happens. And it just has such poetic potential, these in-between spaces that are, again, unresolved and raw.
Well, I think time has to factor into that, right? Because like a digital glitch, you get immediately, you see the results immediately. But like in ceramics, you make something, you glaze it, you put it in the kiln, it comes out and it's not what you expected. That's the sort of common glitch. So there's this time lag.
Absolutely. There's this like gap, right? There's this like, and Legacy Russell just writes so profoundly about this in her book, Lit Feminism. And so, reading that with my students through the pandemic, we had this just instead of only stewing in a kind of misery, which we did have, and we acknowledged that together, there were also these other kind of folds of experience that held the unexpected.
I wanted to jump back to one of the things that you talk about, this relationship between writing and making, and between language and artistic production, let's say. And so I believe that you've been working on these ceramic books. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Pustaha series.
So what's a ceramic book?
Well, I'm not the first. There's many people making book forms and trying to make them last in clay. But I have been, as I said, reaching back into the past of my family's history and learning more about my great-great-grandfather, who was a shaman in Batak, Indonesia. And he was living at a time where the Dutch had colonized Indonesia and were trying to convert as many people to be more malleable to the context of empire. And when the Dutch missionaries or the Rhenish missionaries were coming to the village to convert and to target the shamans particularly, he refused. And they asked to come to his house for dinner then. And so, being a very food-centric culture, he invited them into his home. And around the dinner table, he was about to serve the food with his family. And they said, let's bow our heads for prayer over the food. So let's close our eyes, bow our heads. And so he did that. And while his eyes were closed and head was bowed, they cut his hair off. And that act of kind of violent severing from his identity, his power as a shaman, was deeply traumatic. And he, as my grandmother tells the story, fell to the ground. And that's this kind of turning point in the story of my family. And since then, through the project of missionizing, we've, as a family, been severed from a lot of the knowledge that was at the core of my great-great-grandfather's shamanistic practice. So as a healer and as a spiritual leader of his village, and then, unmade, that kind of led to years of not knowing anything about the language. I don't speak, my father doesn't speak, no one from the Toronto, part of the family speaks the Batak language. And I just recently went to California and met my family in California, and they do speak Batak. But in my research in the last 3 or 4 years, I've discovered that there was a whole tradition of Batak shamans' books. And these books were pounded from tree bark, and they were very long. The longest one that's known in museums right now is 17 meters long at the Tropen Museum or the Wereld Museum in Amsterdam. And they're written and drawn on both sides. And I only found out about these books after I had, at the beginning of the pandemic, when I was in isolation and kind of didn't feel able to focus on my clay work, I bought a 30-foot roll of paper and I started drawing and writing on both sides of it. And I was copying text that I found, but I also was looking at Batak iconography and making pictograms and kind of echoing that. And there was nowhere in my knowledge that I could have known that this was part of a long format book tradition. So I thought I was experimenting with other media. I thought it was bringing in, different, watercolors and so glitter and, all the things I like to.
Little did you
kind of
know, it's
mess
in your
with.
bones, it's in your
Yeah,
blood,
it's
there.
old.
Yeah, it's old.
Yeah, it's historic. It's a tradition that that I just didn't know. And so I think that chance to remember things through movement and through touching material, I think that just has potential that I wasn't aware of consciously before. And so when I found that several months later, these books existed, I started, really looking at them online. But then I also was able to go to London and spend a day at the British Library. And I spent time with 17 of these books, just kind of looking through them and drawing from them. And I went to a residency in the Netherlands, and not only because it's the country that colonized the Indonesian people back then, historically, but because they have a really amazing ceramic center there. The European Ceramic Work Center is in Oosterwijk. And that was a chance to be in more direct contact with my awareness of these stories. I just was able to start making these books from long pieces of clay, pounding them, not from tree bark, but from clay, but using the material that I'm familiar with, but the gestures that maybe came from some place that I wasn't conscious of before. When I visited my family in California, they can speak the Batak language, but they weren't aware that there was a written language. The European missionaries had stopped, printing anything in the Batak language. So the erasure of that indigenous knowledge really is something that is at the core of my research and my personal endeavor now to kind of reach into the knowledge that I'm hoping that can shed light on the ways that I hope to live and operate in the world now.
It's also another way of storytelling in the sense that it's the story that you've carried in your body or has been carried down to you through your body. And then to embody that again through the clay, I think is a really beautiful way of thinking about time and trauma and histories and memories and all of those things that we do, even if we don't recognize that we know them, we know them. They are inherited in so many ways. And so I think that then to bring it back through the clay where it's an embodied practice is a really interesting choice.
There's something about labor, do that physical labor. It pushes me to the limit of what I can handle, physically. I feel like in exhaustion and in not submission, but not resignation, but in being so tired that you can't really
Surrender,
only,
more like surrender. I can't remember the text, and I was trying to about artists as blue collar workers. I'm sure it's late 20th century, kind of writing, the sort of physicality of, even the abstract expressionist painters or making sculpture where it takes so much physicality to make sculpture. You're bringing it back again in a way through your work, drawing on the history of your family and your ancestors to bring it back as well.
Yeah, and I think by doing it, by having your body pound and fold and draw and write and to inscribe, just by those are gestures of remembering. Like Emma Nishimura and I just had a two-person show in Toronto at United Contemporary, and that was the title of our exhibition, Gestures of Remembering, and having that chance to just be completely embodied in something that was traumatic and is traumatic. I think that that intense physical labor is also a place to put the anxiety and the difficult emotions to hold. The physical work, kind of. I want that to be visible. So it started with pinching, but now there's actually,
banging and
it's like
punching.
Yeah.
But it's also connected, I think, to kind of memory in some ways of like linking what that feels like to be making in the same way or drawing in the same way or writing the same text or I mean, maybe you're not even understanding what you're writing, but your body is making the same gestures, mimicking the labor that was involved. And I think that there's something about that that's kind of like reignites your body in ways that maybe it has forgotten.
Absolutely. And it also just ignites connections in the world that you don't expect by putting this work into the world. I'm also looking at other people who might be interested in these books, and I'd never looked at that possibility before. And I found online someone had, seen an image of the Pustahas and written a comment that they wished that their own culture, their own Indonesian culture, had access to these books because they were all taken from Indonesia and are here in New York and in Europe in many museums. And it's very difficult to access. I've been fortunate through my academic position to be able to go to some of the museums and to handle the books. And so I reached out to Kawan Pustaha and Life Patch, who are activist artist groups based in Yogyakarta, and they are working to decolonize museums by asking for repatriation of the books. And this work is vital to connecting the indigenous knowledge with people who are living in Indonesia, and those sources, need to be available and live again, fully alive again, with the people whose culture is missing them.
It's this whole idea that you've already talked about in your work of it being incomplete or being these holes or being something that is unfinished. And so I think that also is a return of those books is part of that process.
Absolutely. And so we've been meeting online over the last year. I actually fell after making the sculptures of my fallen body, and I actually had a slip and fall.
Sorry, I'm laughing at that. That's awful that I did. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just so like it's just bad luck. But and I didn't take my reading glasses off, So I'm like running across this floor, and my feet fly up. Anyway, I hit my head, got a concussion, and I wasn't able to focus on much for a few months, except for learning to write this alphabet. And so these new friends and colleagues in Yogyakarta were so generous in teaching me to write the text. Because before that point, I was just literally copying like a child would into the clay books what I saw and thought a letter was. I didn't know which way was up. The page could have been upside down, and it was in many cases sideways, because I just don't know these things. But so I'm so grateful. So there's this kind of excitement, that really personal and professional excitement I have around this chance to connect with other artists who are relearning this knowledge.
Or recovering, perhaps. Yeah. Recovering this language.
Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to see some of your work in person. I know that you have a bunch of things coming up. What's on the agenda?
Well, in Canada, 2025, I'll have a show opening in the earlier part of the year at Calgary Contemporary, and it'll be a mix of video projection and sculpture. And then in the fall, a solo show at the Gardner Museum, and that will be incorporating some of the ideas that we've been talking about today, and hopefully some of the video and projections and voice recordings that I've made of my family talking around the table. All these years, I've thought that I was working with found objects in a way to contribute to kind of a contemporary, kind of upcycling, way of working with all the kitsch objects and things that I find in thrift shops. But I discovered very recently that the ceramics that were used by my Batak shaman ancestors were found. They wouldn't make the ceramics themselves for the substances that were used in rituals, but they would buy or find them from potters from Vietnam, China, and Thailand. And that shook me up. I thought that this was something that I had been, kind of engaged in a dialogue with the field of ceramics, but actually it's something much older that goes back generations in my family.
Also speaks to contact, right? Of like moments of contact in the world, of one group of people exchanging goods, ideas.
That exchange. Yeah.
I wonder what they called it, if not found objects. That seems so art speak, and I'm sure they called it something else.
So this is a generational kind of practice that I thought was something that I had, just been playing with as part of contemporary art dialogue. But it's actually something that my great-great-grandfather would have used these to hold substances for rituals. And they are called permanunkin, and they often have a wooden carved stopper that's a traditional Batak figure, often one stacked on top of another, animal or human forms. And then at the very top, there's a lock of hair that's the top. And like 21 years ago, 22 years ago, when I was at Sheridan as a student, I cut a piece of my hair and I put it at the top of a ceramic pot. And I still remember, like, my friends were so grossed out. My teacher was like, "Ew." There's this sense of revulsion when we see hair, but for Batak culture, it's a very powerful embodiment of identity and power.
I think there's a lot of that in many cultures, whether it's ritualistic or whether it's sentimental reasons. The thing that doesn't disappear so easily, and yet it's also gross.
Yeah. When it's off the body, it has this like sense that
it has this
something's
weird,
wrong,
icky
something's
thing.
off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
about it.
It's too personal. It's like, yeah. So I'm inviting my cousins and their kids to send me locks of their hair this year, and it holds our DNA. So there's this sense of connectedness through these parts of ourselves that they're generously sharing with me.
Exactly. And then connecting it back to the story of your great-great-grandfather who had his hair cut. It's all very connected, even though we've talked about disconnection and we've talked about kind of the unfinishedness of so many of the things that you're working on. Actually, it's very connected, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's just the linking thing,
Yeah.
one thing to another in this kind of nonlinear.
But it keeps returning back too. Like everything you've talked about has a return back to this moment in Batak culture. And so I think that's the link for you, or that's the
keystone.
The key. It's key. It's key to your work.
And at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how you like the freneticness, how do I say this? Freneticness of New York City. How is that seeping into your work?
I don't think I answered your question well at the beginning about how I got to New York City. Yeah. But yeah, what draws me to New York City is this really kind of surging energy, this constantly moving, constantly changing, and so much. The too muchness of everything is part of the way that we see ourselves and our ambitions and hopes. And also it's quite fractured. You're up on the street, you're down on the subway, you're, the sense of being part of a community and yet isolated from many parts of the city and parts of culture here. And, everything from the economic disparity to the social and political inequities and injustices here, that just, I think, doesn't let anyone escape from the realities that I think is important to bring into work. And not that I've ever felt that my work was trying to escape, but for me, it's important to kind of keep myself in a place that is not comfortable, like New York City or Bangkok, or places that, while it's, simulating and I learn so much here, it's also a way that I keep my fractured state in some kind of connectedness to other fractured states, if that makes any sense. There's a sense of that there are lots of pieces and parts. And as someone who has gone back and forth between Southeast Asia and North America, I can only experience and understand and grope towards my identity in fragments. I only know it piece by piece and part by part. I don't ever have a grasp on it as a whole. I don't even see it as a whole.
Right. And that is possible here in New York City, to keep hold of that fragmentation. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's like when I go to an installation, like I bring everything I have. I bring all the crates. There's like over 100 crates. We open them up, put them all along the gallery walls or the whatever. And I feel like that's what we bring to the city. It's like, because things happen so quickly and there's so much going on, there's just this like high level of intensity that makes things either stick or not. And, and it's that kind of, it's that volume of possibility that intrigues me and draws me. And I think, it kicks my ass every day. So that also kind of that challenging,
It's invigorating.
yeah. There's without romanticizing it, because I am in a position of privilege where I came for work, and that gives me a way to survive here, and that's not to be taken for granted. But
And you can't take it for granted when you live
No.
in New York. I mean, unless you live in some isolated tower and you never leave, like you experience it every day. And I think that's part of the New York experience too, is that you're seeing people who are not like you or who don't have the same kind of privilege or equity. And so you think, like, you can't hide from that.
right, and people call you on shit.
Mhm.
So there's that honesty that I really appreciate as well.
Keeps you honest, yeah.
Brutal, but
Thank you so much for talking to us and telling us about your work and your life and everything else. It's been really great to have you here chatting with us. For our listeners, if you want to find out more about Linda's work, you can visit lindasormin.com, LINDASORMIN.com.
Please take a moment to hit the like button, rate us, and review the show. It makes a big difference in helping us reach more listeners.
Your tax-deductible donations make this podcast possible. Please support us at internationalarrivals.org.